What is going on, Hive Warriors? So before we even get into this study, we definitely have to talk about the fact that a lot of people think that your muscles are going to disappear when you fast. They always tell you, listen, I would love to do intermittent fasting, but the thing is, I'm going to lose all the muscle that I built, and I'm actually trying to build muscle, so intermittent fasting just isn't a viable option for me. Now, that is simply bro science. That is assimilating the concept of not eating with automatic muscle degradation. But that's not how it works, right? That's not how protein synthesis works. There are different things that one can do to ensure that you are maintaining a healthy level of protein synthesis. And also, there aren't any studies that when things are equated for in terms of exercise and resistance training, that they show that there is a complete separation between those who do fasting or some type of fasting regimen versus those who just do caloric restriction. So without any further ado, let's jump into this brand new study that just dropped in November, so we can go ahead and talk about this discrepancy or lack thereof when it comes to muscle and intermittent fasting. Short-term intermittent fasting and energy restriction do not impair rates of muscle protein synthesis. A randomized controlled dietary intervention trial by Ermi W.K. Cowell and colleagues, and this just dropped very recently, November 2024. So it's a very recent study. Obviously, they started putting it through on publication the September 26, 2024, but even with this date, this is in terms of a study, this is like 2 seconds ago. If in study in study time, November or September is like 2 seconds ago, 1 second ago, in terms of how new this study is, right? So let's take a look at what they say. We're gonna briefly go through it. We're not gonna go through the whole thing, just so that you know kind of what the methodology was, because that's always important, and then what the results were, right? So they used 3 types of groups, right? They used the alternate day fasting group, and they used a continuous energy restriction group. So they wanted to compare these two here. And then they also did a controlled diet group, right? And what they found were that in the results, there were no difference in daily muscle protein synthesis between groups: ADF, calorie continuous energy restriction, and of course the control group. It was all incredibly similar. You can see the p-value here is less than 0.05, making it statistically significant, showing that all of this is actually more than likely the case because of the interventions and not because of some random event. The reduction in body mass were greater in the alternate day fasting group and the continuous energy restriction in compared to the controlled diet group. Lean and fat mass were decreased by a similar magnitude across groups. Fasting plasma leptin concentration decreased in ADF and continuous energy restriction, with no difference in fasting plasma glucose or insulin concentration between groups. Okay, so in conclusion, basically short-term alternate day fasting does not lower rates of muscle protein synthesis compared to continuous energy restriction or energy balance controlled diet with matched protein intake. So that is an important element. One of the pillars of protein synthesis is consumption of actual protein intake. So when you equate for the protein intake, you see a very similar growth in muscle protein, in protein synthesis or muscle overall, or muscle retention. If you lack some protein intake, you'll see a very similar degradation of muscle or breakdown of muscle tissue in the same way, regardless of what you're doing. So the thing is where people would see stuff where fasting groups would have less muscle, or they'll end up with more muscle loss, right? You'll see these studies where a lot of these YouTubers or these fitness guys are talking about this. They're like, oh man, that looks like the intermittent fasting stuff looks like they're losing more muscle than than the regular continuous energy restriction group. I don't know how that's happening, but that's what we see. We got to keep. They're not being necessarily super honest with you. There isn't a direct when it comes to that, there isn't a actual comparable diet that they're both doing, right? For example, there might be less protein in the intermittent fasting group, or there might be less resistance training in the intermittent fasting group. When you equate for the same amount of training in terms of resistance training as well as protein intake, it doesn't matter if you're doing calorie restriction or if you're doing intermittent fasting, you're still going to keep the same amount of muscle protein synthesis that's going to allow for muscle growth or muscle retention. Okay, so one thing that I do want to emphasize on here is that it was just 10 days, right? So obviously there might be some similarities even between how the weight loss and how that worked between these groups, because it is just 10 days, but it is looking at but it is very detailed in the way that they actually look at the muscle protein synthesis. So even though it's 10 days, there isn't anything that would indicate that continuing this pattern would lead to more muscle degradation with the intermittent fasting group versus the caloric restriction group or the controlled diet group. And the reason that is the case is because they did a methodology with saliva, blood, and skeletal muscle sampling was used to assess integrated rates of MPS, which is muscle protein synthesis, over the 10-day intervention period. Secondary measures included fasting plasma glucose, insulin, gastrointestinal hormone concentration, continuous glucose monitoring, and assessment of body composition. So they didn't just do an assessment of body composition; they got as detailed, as in-depth to basically to the microscopic level as you can possibly get to ensure that they're seeing what they're going to conclude is based off of that detailed analysis. So yeah, you can do intermittent fasting. You can do it if you're wanting to build muscle. You can do it if you're losing weight and you want to retain muscle. You can do it if you're trying to do body recomposition, which is losing weight while still building muscle, depending on a few prerequisite factors that can happen. So yes. And yes to this works, no to the notion that if you assimilate not eating, you're automatically just losing muscle. That's not how that works. It's not how that works. All right. So hopefully, people are looking at these kind of studies as well that are equating for everything. It's very easy to find one group having less muscle if one group is eating protein and the other one is not eating protein at the level of this group, or one group is doing resistance training but the other one isn't. If you don't actually control for the workout and the protein intake, you're going to have discrepancies there. One group might eat more than the other group. One group might eat less. One group might work out more than the other group. One group might work out less. That's just inevitable because you're not controlling for that. Here, they controlled for that. That's what you have to do if you want an accurate depiction of what happens if somebody's doing intermittent fasting versus if somebody's just doing continuous energy restriction. So hopefully this video has opened your eyes to understand that. Now, I will go as far as to say, is it the most optimal thing to do intermittent fasting and build muscle at the same time? I would say no, it isn't the most optimal thing, because one of the pillars of muscle protein synthesis, it's consuming protein right at an adequate level. It's caloric surplus, being actually at a caloric surplus, which continuous energy restriction and intermittent fasting, if done to lose weight, automatically clips that pillar off. It's also doing actual exercise, which is one of the biggest factors, doing actual resistance training. But that fourth factor is meal frequency, having more meals per day, which lends to the protein synthesis as you're kind of spreading the protein intake throughout the day, which could be a little bit more effective. But it's just like a little bit more, like it's more optimal. But if you're not trying to be, Mr. Olympia or whatever, or you're not trying to compete on stage in terms of muscle, then it doesn't really matter. It's so negligible. It's just that little bit that you might get to put yourself in that position if you're trying to compete at a high level. The same way, if you flip it, caloric restriction is not the most optimal in comparison to intermittent fasting when it comes to body fat reduction, as we've seen in studies. Even when they are equated for and everything seems to be very similar and the same, there's still a little bit more body fat loss in the intermittent fasting group. So if your focus is to lose more body fat and be at the most optimal level, then intermittent fasting would be the thing to go to, right? If your focus is to retain as much muscle as possible, build as much muscle as possible, and you want to be at the most optimal level, then caloric restriction with meal frequency, which with allowing meal frequency to pull that off, would be the most optimal thing that you can do. But again, most optimal in comparison to what? What is exactly that you're trying to do? You can still build a great amount of muscle with intermittent fasting while still using intermittent fasting. One thing that's definitely not the case when it comes to intermittent fasting is that it is not, by any stretch of the imagination, a tool that degrades muscle if you are doing the things that would help you to keep your muscle while still doing intermittent fasting. By default, just because you're doing intermittent fasting does not mean that you will degrade muscle over time. All right, hopefully this video has helped you guys. And of course, as always, we'll see you in the next one. Peace out, guys.